He thought he had pulled over a car thief. Then he realized the driver was a judge. It was a quiet morning, the kind that felt too brief. Sunrise gold spilling across the highway, late commuters already hunched toward the city, a silver Lexus moving through the dim. Inside, Judge Rhonda Coleman drove with a calm that came from years of early morning routines. She wore a navy pantsuit folded neatly on the passenger seat until she slid it on at a light. She had her calendar in her head and a stack of cases in the trunk. Court was 30 minutes away. The day had a rhythm she understood well. She did not expect to be pulled over. The patrol car's lights appeared in her rear view, sudden and blinking. At first she thought it might be a standard traffic stop. Maybe a light out, a lane change too quick. She eased to the shoulder, rolled down the window and waited. An officer approached under the chill of the morning, his face set, the silhouette of duty visible against the sky. He asked her for registration. She reached for the documents on the dash, placing them where any driver would. Clear, visible. Her identification and the car's papers lay plainly on the dashboard for the officer to see. His posture did not change. He did not lower his voice. He did not move with the same easy cadence some officers use to bridge the separation between uniform and citizen. Instead, he looked long at the papers, then looked back at her, as if the two did not belong in the same frame. "You need to step out of the vehicle," he said. She complied, slid the door open and kept her hands visible at all times. Her right hand rested briefly on her thigh as if to steady herself in the sudden attention. She had no sudden movements to make the officer nervous. She had only a professionalism that sat in her bones. On the dash, the court ID and the registration were folded but unmistakable. The Lexus's plates matched the vehicle's registration. There was no visible damage, no sign of being hot-wired, nothing to suggest theft. Still, the officer lingered. He walked around the car, his gaze tracing the vehicle as if trying to reconcile what he saw with a theory he could not yet name. Something in his tone carried a question he did not voice. "How do you belong to this car?" He asked again where she was headed and why she had left early. She answered calmly. He asked for more details than a routine stop would demand. She gave them. She remained contained. She kept her voice level. The crowd that would later call it a scene had not yet gathered. Only a few cars passed, drivers more curious than alarmed. But one passerby recognized her, not only as a familiar face from television courthouse coverage, but as the person she said she was. Judge Rhonda Coleman. He stopped, stepped out, and said her name to the officer. For a moment the air shifted. Someone said, "She's a judge." Phones tilted toward the scene like small constellations. The officer's jaw tightened. He radioed dispatch, his voice steady but terse. He described a possible stolen vehicle and asked for verification, a procedure he was trained to follow. He did what the uniform demanded. He called it in. He asked for backup. He never put his hand on his holster, not in that way, but his hand hovered near his duty belt more than usual, a kept readiness. Nearby, other people slowed to watch. A woman on a bike put her phone up. Two students from a nearby college parking lot leaned on a fence, murmuring. Minutes stretched like thin wire. Then another cruiser rolled up, driven by a younger officer, Officer Sato. He had a quieter energy, his face still open, perhaps untroubled by the manual assumptions that can calcify in older habits. He stepped up, exchanged a few words with Officer Brent Holstead, the first officer on scene, and then reached for the radio himself. He ran the plate, checked the registration on his device, and spoke into the air with that small, buoyant sound of confirmation. The plates matched the car. Dispatch verified the name and title. For a moment, the conversation turned from potential criminal to verification of identity, simple bureaucratic functions that in this scene carried disproportionate weight. Holstead's posture did not immediately soften. He had made a choice in his mind about what he had stopped. Confirmation did not reverse that choice as easily as facts do in human interaction. Pride can stick like adhesive, and the human impulse to be right sometimes outlives the evidence. He kept his voice clipped. He asked questions that sounded like accusations. Judge Coleman did something small but meaningful. She locked the door briefly, then unlocked it and stepped out on her terms. In that gesture was a refusal to be further degraded by procedure that felt like contempt. She did not lash out. She did not call attention in order to claim authority. She used the kind of calm that steadied the moment instead of inflaming it. When she spoke, her words were precise and controlled. "I am a judge," she said, not as a demand for special treatment but as a statement of identity, a reminder of roles and responsibilities coded in public life. Some in the crowd later quoted her differently. For those who watched the body camera footage, the clarity of her speech was undeniable. For others who only heard fragments, memory shapes meaning with gaps. But the record showed what happened next. Officer Soto relayed the confirmed information to Holstead. Voices softened in the way that occurs when a disputed fact settles. Yet Holstead did not immediately apologize, nor did he say, "I'm sorry." Pride sometimes is slow to meet its own error. A bystander whose name would later appear in local coverage, Troy, the judge's assistant, arrived on the scene and approached with respectful urgency. Her husband, Terrell, was on the phone from down the street, calling and pacing. The small knot of witnesses expanded into a crowd that would hold the moment on film and memory. Phones collected angles, each clip a potential cudgel of evidence and caption. It would be those devices later that turned a private indignity into a public conversation. The first officer was placed on administrative leave, while the department announced an internal affairs review. Chief Daniels, the city's police chief, a man who carried the office's weight and the city's hope for accountability, issued a statement acknowledging the complaint and promising a careful investigation. Lieutenant Marie Trent of Internal Affairs convened the initial review with the sort of procedural gravity the office reserves for moments when public confidence could be shaken. Darren Levy, the mayor's chief policy advisor, reached out to the chief's office and to Judge Coleman's staff to understand the city's risk and to assure the judge that the matter would be handled with attention. Those were the steps institutions take when a volatile image threatens civic trust. Yet the institutional steps, the internal affairs notification, the administrative leave, the statements, did not erase what had happened at the curb. They were mechanisms for response. They did not uninstall the instant calculus of suspicion that had led an officer to see a judge as a possible thief. They did not explain why visible credentials on a dashboard could be filtered through a frame that rendered them meaningless. Within hours, the video that a student had captured was online. The clip spread first through local feeds, then across social platforms. Headlines framed the incident precisely as the title had promised. A white patrol officer accused a black woman of driving a stolen car, and froze when the woman turned out to be a judge. For viewers, the clip functioned as both spectacle and mirror. Some saw an example of bias, unequivocal and blunt. Others leaned into procedural defense, insisting the officer had done his job by checking the registration. A third group worried about performative outrage on social media, and about the way a few seconds of film could propel careers and reputations into a spinning public verdict, without the context of a full investigation. Judge Coleman, mindful of her role and also of her humanity, faced a choice familiar to many public figures who are personally harmed: to speak, to remain silent, or to shape the narrative in a way that might serve a larger purpose. She declined a perfunctory press hit. Instead, she accepted an invitation to speak quietly at a nearby university forum later in the week, not to deliver an indictment against a person, but to open a conversation with students about the lived experience of bias and the heavy, sometimes invisible work that public servants carry. In that space, she recounted, in her measured voice, the detail that would move many listeners. The papers were visible on the dash. The plates matched. Still, she was stopped. She did not frame herself as a martyr. She described being seen as a threat in the same breath that she described the ordinary dignity of caring for one's family and doing one's job. She told a story about her father, a private man who taught her, in a single sentence she repeated with a soft smile, that dignity is not armor against other people's fear, but it is the way we keep our balance. The students heard a woman whose life contained both the authority of office and the vulnerability of being misread. They asked her how she managed her anger. She said she had choices: to escalate, to litigate every slight, or to use the moment to teach. She chose, she said, to teach. The case test drove familiar questions about policing, bias, and deference to authority. Why, in a city where a judge's face on television could be recognized by passers-by, did the officer's suspicion override the clear documents? Did training fail to make room for humility when evidence contradicted expectation? Did culture in the department allow habits of looking to persist when actual verification arrived? Chief Daniels addressed those questions publicly without promising definitive outcomes. He acknowledged that the department had to reckon with the perception of bias, and that it would support the internal review. He did not suggest, and city officials could not lawfully assert the officer's ill intent. Instead, he framed the incident as one of many painful moments that require both policy and human attention. Lieutenant Trent's investigation focused on the specific sequence of actions: the initial stop, the officer's decision to order the judge out of the car, the call for backup, and the interaction afterward. Those were discrete questions that, taken together, might reveal whether training had been followed and whether departmental culture required recalibration. Public reaction was predictably varied and instructive. Some commentators argued that the officer had simply followed procedure: identify, question, verify, and that procedure exists precisely to avoid missed crimes. Others declared the stop an archetype of racial profiling. Comment threads churned with arguments about respectability politics, that if a person dressed differently or occupied certain public roles, they might be shielded by status. Judge Coleman pushed back against that framing. She argued that respectability, credentials, or early morning civility should not be a prerequisite for basic human safety or deference of fact. The point, she said quietly in the forum, was not that a judge is more or less deserving of respect. The point was that visible proof of identity should not be filtered out by expectation. Her remarks about respectability cut to a deeper civic unease. Many people, especially those in marginalized groups, carry the weight of constant impression management, the labor of looking less threatening, of performing a demeanor that protects them in public spaces. The stop illustrated what so many had described in essays and testimony: that even when a person meets all outward markers of societal success, bias can still bend a routine interaction into a confrontation. For some viewers who had never known that fear, watching the footage seemed to awaken a new understanding. For others who had lived with it, the video was a confirmation, a raw, visual ledger of what they knew, but could not always prove. Judge Coleman did not file for immediate legal action in the days after the incident. She worked with her staff and with the mayor's office to make sure the internal processes ran on schedule. She balanced her role as public official with private family life. Her husband Terrell kept to the edges, protective but not performative. She did ask for a clear accounting from the police department, and she attended meetings where officials explained their timeline. Internal Affairs would review body-worn camera footage, identify any procedural breaches, and make recommendations. Administrative leave for Officer Holstead was an expected stop in that timeline, a standard administrative step while an investigation was ongoing. It did not imply guilt or innocence. It simply suspended the officer's public-facing duties pending the review. Those procedural realities mattered to legal watchers and bureaucrats in the mayor's office, but they meant less to the citizens who watched the clip on repeat and shared their outrage. Social amplification did something important. It created pressure for clarity, and it forced a public conversation that departmental statements alone might not have sparked. The clip circulated to reporters who asked pointed questions in press briefings. Cable segments replayed small moments from the exchange, and local commentators debated the fine line between policing as a public safety function and policing as a profession susceptible to cultural blind spots. In the city's precinct hallways, conversations shifted. Some officers were defensive, feeling their work had been unfairly judged by a fraction of footage. Others were reflective, acknowledging that a profession built around quick judgments can, at times, see what it expects rather than what is. Training officers began to review the case as a study in de-escalation and in bias awareness, not as a condemnation, but as material for improvement. Lieutenant Trent's review included suggested steps not to guarantee outcomes but to limit recurrence, more emphasis on how to verify identity without escalating posture, clearer protocols for interacting with visibly credentialed professionals, and increased training on implicit bias. In private, Judge Coleman fielded calls from colleagues. judges who had at times faced suspicion when traveling in public, lawyers who had their own stories of being stopped for reasons thin as air. She received notes from people who said they feared for friends and family. She heard from younger black women who said simply, "Thank you for staying calm." Those messages did not heal the sting of being mistrusted. They provided company in grief. That company became the scaffolding of civic action. The mayor's office declined to make grand pronouncements. Darren Levy, the chief policy advisor, coordinated conversations between City Hall and the police department, emphasizing process and transparency. He knew that the city's long-term response could not hinge only on a public relations statement. It would require an honest look at how policy, training, and community relations intersected. Yet he also knew the political realities. Promises could not be spun out of thin air, and legal constraints limited what officials could say about internal investigations. For many residents, those bureaucratic caveats read like excuses. They wanted swift answers. They wanted assurance that this would not simply be a momentary viral flash with no follow-through. The video's reach extended beyond local borders. In interviews on national shows, some commentators cited the clip as another data point in a long list of incidents illustrating how Black Americans are disproportionately suspected of criminality. Others used it as an example of how body cameras and citizen recordings can provide a check on official authority. In classrooms, at church groups, in living rooms, and in social feeds, conversations unfolded in language that tried to translate an immediate event into a structural lesson. People asked, "How do we teach officers to see better? How do we restructure incentives so that verification is not subsumed by suspicion?" Judge Coleman returned to the bench within a week, carrying the public incident like an ache that had not yet scarred. Her work resumed with the meticulous care of someone who believed in the rule of law. She had a docket to manage and cases to decide. The public watched, some with renewed respect, others with reservation. Her courtroom, for her, served as a counterpoint to the curb. Here were structured rules and voices that mattered in a different register. She moved between these spaces with a quiet steadiness. She understood that her personal dignity might not change the policing system overnight, but she also knew that small acts of testimony, recounting, explaining, refusing to be rendered invisible, might contribute to a longer arc. In the weeks that followed, the administrative review continued. Internal Affairs collected testimony, reviewed body-worn camera footage, and examined dispatch logs. The department reiterated that investigations required time to produce findings that would stand up to public scrutiny. Lieutenant Trent released a procedural memo clarifying certain steps officers should take and emphasizing de-escalation language. Chief Daniel spoke publicly about the need for trust between police and community while acknowledging the fragility of that trust. He did not make promises he could not keep. He did not absolve the department of responsibility to look inward. The incident also prompted small but concrete actions in the community. A local civil rights organization organized a forum on civilian oversight and the filing of complaints. Another civic group set up a Know Your Rights workshop focusing on traffic stops and interactions with law enforcement. These were not panaceas. They were part of the civic toolkit: information, resources, the ability to file complaints with civilian review boards and internal affairs. The community urged officials to make reporting mechanisms more accessible and to ensure that civilian oversight had teeth. For many observers, the most striking feature of the event was not the administrative aftershocks or the news cycles, but the moral image it created. A figure of authority reduced for a moment to a suspect by the quick muscles of expectation. That image underscored an old lesson: credentials and dignity do not always disarm prejudice. That fact made the incident resonate beyond this city. It connected to a national narrative about who is seen as dangerous and who is seen as credible, and it pushed the question: how did we get to a place where simple paperwork could be read as a claim to be doubted? Judge Coleman, in later interviews and in private remarks, insisted on a subtle distinction. She did not want the story to be a simple indictment of policing. She wanted it to be a conversation starter about how systems can be improved and how the public could be part of that improvement. She emphasized practical steps that citizens could take if stopped: keep hands visible, avoid sudden movements, but also understand that procedure can be weaponized by bias, and that people have the right to ask for clarity without escalation. She encouraged citizens to film interactions when safe to do so, to take note of badge numbers, to report behavior that seemed inappropriate, and to hold public institutions to the light of accountability. Those recommendations carried an implicit tension. They asked individuals to learn how to survive an encounter that ideally should not have been dangerous in the first place. That burden, why should the person threatened have to train to avoid being a target, was the core injustice that shook many who watched. Yet practical advice remained necessary in a climate of recurring incidents. In time, the rawness of the moment softened in public conversation, but it did not disappear. The narrative moved into a more studied phase. Panel discussions, opinion pieces, training seminars that used the clip as a case study. Some proposed modest policy changes, clearer guidelines for handling stops when the driver presents official identification, mandatory de-escalation training updates, and increased emphasis on humility in the face of contradicting evidence. Others proposed larger institutional reforms aimed at civilian oversight and community policing models. None of these proposals were guaranteed. They required political will, budgets, and sustained attention. Judge Coleman returned to the small rituals that made life ordinary. She took a slow drive through the neighborhood one evening, the Lexus a familiar companion now loaded with new memory. She watched the streetlights come on and thought, perhaps, about the odd intimacy of a city that can reduce the entire dignity of a life to a few minutes at the side of a road. She gathered with friends and family and spoke, infrequently, about the day. She listened to the reactions. She never lost sight of the fact that, for every public episode that makes headlines, countless other stops occur that never do. Lives shaped by suspicion, often without the corrective lens of public recording. There was no tidy moral closure. That was, in some ways, the point. Civil institutions had begun their processes. The officer had been placed on administrative leave, while internal affairs completed its work. Chief Daniels had acknowledged the review. The mayor's office had coordinated its outreach. None of those steps promised definitive justice or sweeping reform, and the public knew it. But the incident had surfaced something the city could no longer comfortably ignore. How assumptions take hold. How procedures meant to protect can be experienced as personal affronts, and how a simple act of verification should not be filtered through a cultural lens that renders some people plausibly criminal, while others remain assumed innocent until proven otherwise. If there was a moral to this moment, it lived not in the shaming of one officer, nor in the viral clip alone. It lived in the small daily decisions people make when they encounter difference, whether to look twice, to ask, to listen, to unlearn. It lived in the institutional willingness to examine practices and to take incremental steps toward repair. It lived in the humble truth that dignity is not an impenetrable shield against other people's fear, but it is a force that can change the tenor of a moment if it is wielded intentionally. The last images that lingered in public memory were simple. A silver Lexus rolling away from the curb, Judge Coleman's composed silhouette as she crossed the street, the cluster of phones recording, and a city that had to look at itself through those small screens. The conversation that followed was messy, human, and necessary. It did not produce instant transformation, but it did demand attention. If this story resonates with you, stay with it. There are ways to act beyond the outrage of a clip. Learn how to file a complaint with Internal Affairs, connect with a local civil rights organization, or attend a community forum on police practices. Talk to your neighbors. Teach young people what to do during stops. Push for civilian oversight that has real access to review and that is resourced to follow through. Share responsibly, with facts, and ask institutions to do the work that keeps a city's trust intact. In the end, the stop at the side of the road became a teaching moment more than a verdict. It illustrated how quickly a routine interaction can tilt into suspicion, and it reminded citizens and officials alike that accountability cannot be passive. It required witnesses who would not let the moment dissolve into rumor, a department willing to examine itself, and a public ready to demand better. The man who had flicked his lights at the Lexus had believed he had caught a thief. He had been wrong in that instance. The real theft was subtler. The theft of presumption of innocence for a woman simply trying to get to work. That theft did not vanish with a verification on a radio. It seeped into everyday life and into the stories people told each other about safety and belonging. The remedy was neither simple nor immediate. It started with recognition, continued with procedural diligence, and only began to mend when citizens, officials, and officers all chose to see one another more clearly. Share the story. Talk about it with respect. And if you want resources, look for local guides on filing police complaints, civil rights organizations in your area, and community groups that offer Know Your Rights training. Those are practical steps that translate a moment of outrage into a longer conversation about justice, dignity, and the kind of city people want to live in.